The pen was millimeters from the paper. A $4.2 billion merger that would cement her legacy forever. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors shattered open. A breathless janitor clutching a crumpled coffee-stained folder screamed the unthinkable, "Don't sign it!" Security lunged. But what the billionaire CEO did next made the entire room freeze. The digital clock in the janitorial closet glowed a harsh red, 2:14 a.m. For Thomas Wright, the world was entirely silent except for the rhythmic, hypnotic hum of his industrial floor buffer. On the 65th floor of the Sterling Vanguard Tower in downtown Chicago, he was essentially a ghost. Men in $5,000 Brioni suits and women in razor-sharp Tom Ford walked past him during the day without a second glance. To them, he was merely part of the building's infrastructure, a pair of hands attached to a blue uniform, holding a mop or a trash bag. They didn't know that 5 years ago, Thomas was a senior forensic auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, WC. They didn't know he had a brilliant mind for numbers, capable of spotting a fractional discrepancy in a 1,000-page ledger. And they certainly didn't know why he had traded his tailored suits for a name tag. His wife Sarah had passed away from an aggressive glioblastoma 3 years prior. The medical debt had completely obliterated their savings, their 401k, and the equity in their home. Shortly after, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder. The treatments required Thomas to be at the hospital during the day, forcing him to abandon his demanding corporate career for night shifts. He was drowning in $142,000 of medical debt. But as long as he could hold his daughter's hand during her daytime infusions, scrubbing floors at night was a price he gladly paid. At the absolute top of this glass and steel ecosystem was Caroline Sterling. At 41, Caroline was the sole heir and CEO of Sterling Vanguard, one of the largest real estate and private equity conglomerates in North America. The financial press routinely dubbed her the Ice Queen of LaSalle Street. She was fiercely intelligent, notoriously ruthless in negotiations, and currently fighting for her corporate life. A hostile faction on her own board of directors was attempting to oust her, claiming her conservative leadership was stalling the company's growth in comparison to rivals like BlackRock and Vanguard. To silence them, Caroline had engineered the coup of the decade, a $4.2 billion merger with Croft Capital, a seemingly unstoppable tech investment firm led by the charismatic Wall Street darling Nathaniel Croft. The deal would merge Sterling Vanguard's immense liquid assets with Croft's high-heeled tech portfolio. It was heralded by the Wall Street Journal as the merger that would redefine American equity. Nathaniel Croft had been given a temporary executive suite on the 64th for the final 2 weeks of due diligence. Because Croft frequently worked past midnight, Thomas was assigned to clean his suite in the early hours of the morning. It was Tuesday, just 3 days before the highly anticipated Friday signing, when the ghost found the first breadcrumb. Thomas was emptying Croft's heavy brass wastebasket. Most executives used the heavy-duty industrial shredders for sensitive documents, but Croft was notoriously arrogant. Nestled among discarded coffee cups and crumpled takeout napkins was a violently crumpled piece of heavy stock paper. Thomas wouldn't have looked twice, but as he dumped the basket into his cart, a sequence of numbers caught his eye. It was a routing code, specifically an offshore routing code for the Cayman Islands, followed by a deeply negative balance. $450,000. Point wait. Quote, my 10,000s tree. Thomas paused. His old POC training kicked in, an involuntary reflex. He smoothed out the crumpled page on his cleaning cart. It appeared to be a severely redacted internal audit sheet for a subsidiary holding company named Apex Horizon LLC. Why would the CEO of a firm boasting record profits be looking at a multi-billion-dollar deficit from a ghost company? Thomas wondered. He took a quick photo of the document with his cracked iPhone before disposing of the paper. Over the next 2 nights, Thomas became a shadow operative. He noticed that Croft often left his suite in a hurry, leaving his encrypted laptop closed but sometimes leaving printed appendices and legal addendums face down on his desk. Thomas never stole anything. He just looked. He memorized, he cross-referenced the data on his ancient refurbished Dell laptop when he went home at 6:12 a.m., right before waking Lily for breakfast. Using publicly available SEC filings, corporate registry databases, and his deep knowledge of forensic accounting, Thomas began connecting the dots. Apex Horizon LLC wasn't just a subsidiary, it was a dumping ground. Nathaniel Croft had made a catastrophic gamble on a series of synthetic collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, 2 years ago, masking the losses through a labyrinth of shell companies in the Caymans and Luxembourg. Croft Capital wasn't a soaring eagle. It was a bloated, rotting carcass. They were absolutely bankrupt. The $4.2 billion merger wasn't a partnership. It was a desperate, illegal bailout. The moment Caroline Sterling's signature touched that contract, Sterling Vanguard's massive cash reserves would be instantly vaporized to cover Croft's toxic, hidden debt. The conglomerate would default, stock prices would plummet to zero, and tens of thousands of employees, including Thomas, would be out on the street. On Thursday night, the eve of the signing, Thomas found the smoking gun. Croft had carelessly tossed a burner phone into the trash, thinking it was securely wiped, but he had left the external SD card slotted inside. Thomas popped it out, plugged it into his phone, and found the unredacted master ledger of Apex Horizon. It was worse than Thomas thought. The deficit wasn't $3.4 billion. It was $5.1 billion. Thomas sat in the sterile glow of the executive washroom, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had the proof. He held the financial lifeblood of a billion-dollar empire in the palm of his calloused, bleach-stained hand. But who would believe a janitor? Friday, 9:30 a.m. The atmosphere in the Sterling Vanguard Tower was electric. Down in the lobby, CNBC and Bloomberg news crews were setting up their cameras ready to broadcast the signing live. Thomas' shift had ended at 6 a.m., but he hadn't gone home. He had called his neighbor to take Lily to school. He was currently sitting in the basement locker room staring at a cheap red cardboard folder. Inside were 30 pages of printed spreadsheets, routing numbers, and undeniable proof of Nathaniel Croft's massive impending fraud. He had tried the proper channels. At 8 a.m., he had approached his facility manager, a gruff man named Henderson, asking for a 5-minute meeting with the legal department. Henderson had literally laughed in his face, threatening to fire Thomas for insubordination and bothering the suits. At 9:45 a.m., Thomas watched the small, grainy television in the break room. The internal corporate channel was broadcasting the boardroom on the 65th floor. The room was spectacular, a sweeping panorama of the Chicago skyline behind a massive, custom-built oak table. Nathaniel Croft was there, looking like a modern-day conqueror in a bespoke navy suit, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile at the cameras. Then Caroline Sterling entered. She wore an immaculate white structured blazer, her expression unreadable, her posture radiating absolute authority. Beside her was David Beckman, Sterling Vanguard's chief legal counsel, carrying the 300-page leather-bound contract. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. If she signs that, everything is gone. Not just the company, Thomas's health insurance. The insurance that was keeping Lily alive. If Sterling Vanguard collapsed, his union benefits would be instantly voided in bankruptcy court. Lily's treatments cost $12,000 a month. Without this job, she would die. It was no longer just about corporate justice. It was about his daughter's life. Thomas grabbed the red folder, shoved it under his arm, and sprinted out of the locker room. He didn't take the main elevators. Security would stop him instantly. Instead, he used his master maintenance keycard to access the reinforced service elevators used for freight and trash removal. He swiped his card. ACC's cats granted. He hit the button for the 65th floor. The elevator seemed to crawl, the mechanical whine of the pulleys echoing in the shaft. Thomas's mind raced. He was about to commit career suicide. He could be arrested for trespassing, corporate espionage, or harassment. He pictured Lily's pale face, her brave little smile as she sat in the dialysis chair. I have to do this. Ding! The doors slid open to the 65th floor service hallway. Thomas burst out. He was still wearing his blue janitorial uniform, his hands rough and slightly stained with industrial cleaner. He jogged down the carpeted hallway toward the main boardroom. As he turned the corner, he saw the massive double mahogany doors. Standing guard were two private security contractors, earpieces in place, arms crossed. Inside the room, the broadcast showed Caroline Sterling being handed a silver Montblanc fountain pen by David Beckman. Mr. Croft, Caroline's voice echoed smoothly over the internal broadcast feed playing on a nearby secretary's monitor. To the future. To the future, Caroline, Croft replied, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a man about to successfully rob a bank in plain sight. Thomas didn't slow down. He lowered his shoulder and charged. Hey, stop right there. One of the guards yelled, stepping forward. Thomas ducked under the first guard's outstretched arm, his momentum carrying him forward. The second guard grabbed Thomas's shoulder, tearing the fabric of his uniform. But Thomas spun, threw his weight against the heavy mahogany doors, and burst into the room. The silence that followed was deafening. The heavy doors slammed against the walls with a sound like a gunshot. The flashing cameras of the corporate photographers abruptly stopped. Every head in the room, 30 executives, lawyers, and board members, snapped toward the entrance. Thomas stood there, chest heaving, hair disheveled, the ripped blue collar of his uniform hanging limply. The two security guards rushed in behind him, immediately grabbing his arms and wrestling him backward. I apologize, Miss Sterling, the head guard barked, struggling to pin Thomas's arms. He slipped past the service corridor. We're removing him now. Nathaniel Croft stood up, his face flushed with immediate arrogant rage. What is the meaning of this? Get this trash out of here immediately. Thomas fought against the guard's grip, his eyes locking directly onto Caroline Sterling, who sat frozen at the head of the table, the silver pen hovering mere inches from the signature line. Don't sign it, Thomas roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. Do not sign that contract. They are bankrupt. The boardroom erupted into chaotic murmurs. David Beckman, the chief counsel, stood up, looking horrified. Security, call the police, now. Miss Sterling, look at the folder, Thomas screamed, dropping the red cardboard folder onto the pristine oak table as a guard yanked him into a chokehold. The folder slid across the polished wood, stopping a few feet from Caroline's hands. Apex Horizon LLC, the Cayman accounts. He's hiding a $5 billion deficit. It's a bailout, not a merger. At the mention of Apex Horizon, Nathaniel Croft's predatory smile vanished. For a fraction of a second, the color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He's a lunatic, Croft shouted, his voice pitching up an octave, suddenly panicked. Get him out, Caroline. Sign the paper and let's be done with this circus. The guards began dragging Thomas backward toward the door. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on Caroline. Caroline Sterling hadn't moved. She hadn't blinked. Her piercing blue eyes shifted from the screaming janitor to the red folder on the table, and finally to Nathaniel Croft's rapidly sweating face. She remembered Thomas. She didn't know his name, but she knew his work. She worked late into the night, often alone. She had noticed how he emptied her trash in complete silence, never interrupting her. More importantly, she had noticed how he carefully dusted the framed photograph of her late father on her desk, always placing it back in the exact millimeter-perfect position. A careless man didn't do that. A crazy man didn't do that. Caroline slowly placed the silver Montblanc pen down on the table. The soft click of the metal against the wood somehow cut through the noise of the room. She raised a single, perfectly manicured hand. Stop, Caroline said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a lethal absolute authority that froze the blood of everyone in the room. The security guards froze in their tracks, Thomas still half-suspended in their grip. "Caroline, this is absurd," Croft stammered, attempting a dismissive laugh that sounded painfully hollow. "He's a janitor, probably disgruntled. Let's finish the signing." Caroline ignored him. She stood up, her eyes locked onto Thomas. "Release him," she commanded the guards. "Ma'am, he breached. I said, release him." The guards immediately dropped their hands, stepping back. Thomas stumbled, straightening his torn collar, breathing heavily. Caroline picked up the cheap red folder. She opened it. The room watched in stunned, breathless silence as the billionaire CEO began flipping through the spreadsheets a night shift janitor had pulled from a trash can. For 60 seconds, the only sound in the massive room was the turning of paper. Caroline's eyes, trained by decades of ruthless financial warfare, scanned the routing numbers, the shell company architectures, the undeniable glaring holes in Croft's financial defenses. When she finally looked up, her expression was terrifyingly blank. She didn't look at Thomas. She looked directly at Nathaniel Croft. "David," Caroline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, addressing her chief counsel without breaking eye contact with Croft. "Yes, Miss Sterling." "Lock the doors." "None." "Lock the goddamn doors, David. Nobody leaves this room." Caroline slammed the red folder shut. "Especially not Mr. Croft." The heavy clack of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a judge gavel. David Beckman, the chief counsel, stood by the mahogany doors, his hand resting on the lock. The two security guards who had just been wrestling Thomas to the carpet now repositioned themselves, effectively blocking the only exit. Nathaniel Croft's perfectly tanned face had turned the color of wet ash. "Caroline, this is illegal," he hissed, his voice trembling as he aggressively buttoned his suit jacket. "This is false imprisonment. You cannot lock me in a room based on the ravings of a man who empties my trash." "I can do whatever I want on my floor, Nathaniel," Caroline Sterling replied smoothly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She turned her attention to the CFO of Sterling Vanguard, a quiet, brilliant man named William Stanton. She slid the red folder across the oak table. "William, tell me what I'm looking at." William adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. The room held its collective breath. For 3 agonizing minutes, the only sound was the rustle of paper and William's sharp intakes of breath. "My God," William whispered, his eyes widening as he traced the routing numbers. He looked up at Caroline, his face devoid of blood. "It's a shell game, Caroline, a massive, catastrophic shell game. The Apex Horizon LLC accounts in the Caymans are holding $5.1 billion in toxic, defaulted synthetic CDOs. Croft Capital isn't just leveraged, they are completely underwater. If you sign that merger, our cash reserves will trigger an automatic debt covenant clause. The banks will seize our assets to pay his debts." "That is stolen property," Croft suddenly screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Thomas. "Those documents are forged. This man is a corporate spy, and I want him arrested immediately." Caroline ignored the billionaire CEO entirely. She stood up, walked slowly down the length of the massive table, and stopped directly in front of Thomas. Thomas was still breathing hard, his blue uniform torn at the shoulder, a smear of industrial floor wax on his cheek. He forced himself to meet the gaze of the most powerful woman in Chicago. "Who are you?" Caroline asked, her voice quiet, intense, and perfectly calm. "And do not tell me you are just a janitor." "My name is Thomas Wright," he said, his voice steadying. "I'm the night shift lead for floors 60 through 65. How does a night shift lead know how to trace a Cayman Islands shadow ledger? Because before my wife got sick, and before I needed a job that let me spend my days at the children's hospital with my daughter." Thomas swallowed hard, refusing to break eye contact. "I was a senior forensic auditor at PricewaterhouseCoopers. I specialized in unraveling offshore tax evasion and corporate insolvency." A collective murmur rippled through the executives at the table. William Stanton's head snapped up. "Thomas Wright, you wrote the 2018 white paper on algorithmic fraud detection for the SEC. Thomas nodded once. I did. Caroline's eyes widened a fraction of an inch, the closest thing to shock the ice queen ever displayed. She turned slowly back to Nathaniel Croft. The Wall Street golden boy looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows. It was a temporary liquidity crisis. Croft stammered, his polished facade shattering completely. He backed away from the table, his hands raised in the pathetic gesture of defense. Caroline, listen to me. The market shifted unexpectedly. If we combine our assets, we can absorb the blow. We can restructure the debt. It's just a temporary cash flow bottleneck. Forgot to work. The $5.1 billion is not a bottleneck, Nathaniel, Caroline said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. It is a crater, and you are going to throw my family's legacy and the livelihoods of 40,000 employees into it just to save your own skin. She turned to her chief counsel. David, call the Securities and Exchange Commission. Get Director Hayes on my private line. Then call the FBI field office downtown. Tell them we have a corporate officer attempting to execute a multi-billion-dollar wire fraud. Caroline, please. Croft begged, his voice cracking. You can't do this. I'll be ruined. My firm will be dissolved by Monday. Your firm was dissolved 2 years ago when you made that catastrophic gamble, Caroline stated coldly. She looked at the security guards. Keep Mr. Croft in that chair until the federal authorities arrive. If he tries to stand up, restrain him. Caroline walked back to the head of the table. She picked up the silver Mont Blanc pen, took the $4.2 billion merger contract, and methodically ripped the signature page directly down the middle. The deal is dead, she announced to the stunned boardroom. Meeting adjourned. She then looked back at Thomas, who was still standing near the door, his adrenaline rapidly fading, leaving him exhausted and terrified. He had stopped the merger, but he had also broken every rule in his union contract. He was undoubtedly going to be fired. Mr. Wright, Caroline said softly, go home to your daughter. I will be in touch. Tuesday, 10 a.m. 4 days later, Thomas sat in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room of the pediatric oncology ward. Lily was asleep in the chair next to him, an IV line feeding a slow, steady drip of immunosuppressants into her fragile arm. The past 4 days had been a blur of terrifying uncertainty. He had been suspended without pay pending an internal investigation. The news, however, had exploded. Nathaniel Croft had been perp-walked out of the Sterling Vanguard Tower in handcuffs by federal agents. The financial markets had reeled. Croft Capital had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by Sunday night, and Caroline Sterling was being hailed by the Wall Street Journal as a genius who had narrowly avoided the greatest corporate trap of the decade. But none of the articles mentioned the janitor. Thomas was fine with that. He didn't want fame, he just desperately needed his job back. His health insurance was set to expire at the end of the month, if his suspension was made permanent. His cheap prepaid cell phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. The caller ID simply read, Esther, Ling Vanguard, Executive Officers. His stomach plummeted. This was it. The official termination call. Hello? Thomas answered quietly, stepping out into the hallway. Mr. Wright. This is Caroline Sterling. Thomas froze. Miss Sterling, are you currently at the hospital with your daughter? Yes, ma'am. I am. Good. Look out the window. Thomas frowned, walking over to the large glass window at the end of the hospital corridor. Down below, idling in the circular driveway, was a sleek black Maybach. Standing next to the open rear door was a driver holding a placard. I've sent a car for you. Caroline's voice crackled through the phone. Lily's nurses have been informed that she will be closely monitored by the head of the department for the next hour. I need you in my office. 40 minutes later, Thomas stepped out of the private elevator onto the 65th floor. He wasn't wearing his blue uniform. He wore his only suit, a 10-year-old charcoal two-piece that felt entirely out of place amidst the Italian marble and modern art. Caroline's executive assistant ushered him into her massive corner office. Caroline was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over Lake Michigan. She turned as he entered, motioning for him to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite her desk. "Mr. Wright," Caroline said, taking a seat. She placed a thick, cream-colored manila envelope on the desk between them. "Miss Sterling, I know I breached protocol," Thomas started, his voice tight with anxiety. "I know I bypassed security, but I couldn't let you sign that paper. Caroline held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Thomas," she said, using his first name for the first time, "when you broke into my boardroom, my board of directors was actively trying to force me out of this company. They believed I was too cautious. They pushed for the Croft merger. If I had signed that document, I would have destroyed my father's company, and I would be facing federal indictments right now alongside Nathaniel Croft." She leaned forward, her blue eyes piercing his. "You didn't just save my company. You saved my life's work. You saved the jobs of every single person in this building. And you did it while making $12.50 an hour." Caroline tapped the thick envelope on the desk. "Inside this envelope are 2 documents," she explained. "The first is an employment contract. I have fired my chief risk officer for failing to spot what you found in a trash can. The position is yours, effective immediately. The starting salary is $450,000 a year plus stock options." Thomas stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "Miss Sterling, I haven't worked in corporate finance in 5 years. I've been scrubbing floors." "You scrubbed my floors," Caroline corrected gently. "And you paid more attention to the details of this company than men I was paying millions. I don't care how long you've been out of the game. You have the job." She slid the envelope closer to him. "But the second document is more important," Caroline continued, her voice softening, losing its corporate edge entirely. "It's a policy enrollment form for the Sterling Vanguard Executive Private Health Trust. It's a platinum-tier program usually reserved for my C-suite. It covers 100% of all medical, surgical, and experimental treatments anywhere in the world with 0 deductibles." "Not could be." A single tear broke loose, tracking down Thomas's cheek. He stared at the envelope as if it were glowing. "I took the liberty of having my assistant contact Lily's lead oncologist," Caroline said softly. "Her upcoming treatments, the specialized dialysis, the outers are just out-of-network specialists. It's all been fully approved and paid for. Your daughter is going to get the best care on the planet, Thomas, and you are never going to worry about the cost again." Thomas Wright, the ghost of the 65th floor, the invisible man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders for 3 agonizing years, finally broke. He buried his face in his rough, calloused hands and wept openly in the office of the billionaire CEO. Caroline didn't say a word. She simply reached across the desk, placing her hands gently on his arm, allowing the man who had saved her empire to finally realize that he too had been saved. If this story of a father's courage and an unexpected twist of fate kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life-inspired drama with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories of hidden heroes and corporate showdowns. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Thomas's shoes?